I think in the past, especially when I was maybe spending a lot of time at the piano, like Boys for Pele, that period of time, people would ask, why don't you put drums on this, because it could be a hit. And you go, yeah, but that's not what the song really wants to be. And I think that this record is one of those records where rhythm wants to be there. So each record is different. You have to approach them as separate beings. Each song is even separate, but this is a whole, it's a story.
18 tracks, it's an epic, isn't it?
No, it's exhausting, huh? Hopefully you feel like, well, yeah, it's a big country, and I think she kind of covered it, and yeah.
The device of Scarlett, why did you use the device of somebody else? Is it to get away from this kind of, are your songs autobiographical? No. Did this really happen to you kind of questioning?
Well, I guess, in the tradition of, say, a Kerouac or somebody, the idea that it might be the person telling the story, and yet it gives room for people to imagine. I mean, Scarlett's very busy. She's doing a lot of stuff. And I'm a mommy, and I'm married, and so she's not. She is not. She has a child in the end. We don't know who the dad is. It could be one of 4.
That was going to be another question, really, is the whole business of having Natasha just like too close to the knuckle to be starting to put that kind of stuff into songs? You're too busy living it to be reflecting it in lyrics and stuff.
Well, you're catching me out, but yeah, I mean, there is a level where right now, to tell a story that is based on real people and based on real events, I have to go answer to this on some level, and yet husband doesn't grill me about who and what and how, and yet it's a little sticky wicket you can get into. So yes, Scarlett is a place where I can hide, but also I love story form, and things can be based on real life, but then they take on a life of their own, and it's sacred, what happens inside your heart.
Just so, but at times when you have had painful experience, it seems to me, right from where we first met you, me and a gun, this is like the most harrowing thing that you somehow managed to exorcise at the time through a kind of autobiographical song, and so I guess maybe there's a distinction between the parts of you that are precious, that are just for you, and parts of you that are precious but hurt, that you can share with other people and also help other people who've gone through a similar kind of space.
Well, I think the idea of a woman traveling alone, I love that idea, especially now in our time in America when things can get pretty violent, as you know. But America's at a crossroads, and information I found last year was difficult to get inside. It sounds like I'm talking about jail, but when you're inside over there, and I was on tour last year after the 11th. I'd been in New York City, obviously, on the 11th, but traveling was something where I found I didn't know what was going on until I got to Europe, and I felt like telling a story right now of a woman that wasn't, she thought she found a soulmate, and maybe he was a soulmate, but it didn't work out, and sometimes it doesn't. And I believe that you have more than one, and you don't, necessarily live with them. But I felt like there are parts of me that are really hard to talk about, and story form is a way to be the most honest. Sometimes.
As a fan, I'm coming at this from the outside, but what resonates for me is that inner truth that you somehow managed to touch in a way that some other writers don't. The I don't know, in previous interviews you've talked about getting to know the monster inside you is kind of important, because unless you can make friends with that monster and embrace the shadow, then, you know, you ain't ever going to be able to enjoy the light properly. And you're able to kind of probe the places behind the surface events, so that you can strike a resonance of what's going on under the skin, under the surface, in your writing, which is a kind of challenging thing to have to live up to.
Okay, last year on the road, at a time when the masks were down and people in America didn't know what tomorrow would bring, this is just where they were. They didn't have, say, this kind of detachment like Europe did. You know, this was the first time that we'd been attacked on land in that way. If you talk to the Native Americans, they'll say, no, we've been invaded before. But anyway, so here we have this shock happening and a paranoia and a paralysis. So you've got to go, that means we need to move. So we toured, got out there. People would say to me, they'd send emails, say, don't cancel, everybody's canceling, and even if you sit there and look silly, we need a place to congregate, to go. I kind of felt like we were sitting around this metaphorical campfire every night, telling stories, things you collected on the way from the last town, because people weren't moving. Some people that were traveling like gypsies with us, kind of in tandem, sort of like the Grateful Dead on a small scale, but that was what it seemed like.
Yeah.
But that's how information was moving from coast to coast for me. I was beginning to see that whatever the cultures were and what cities that was having an effect. Some cities were going, hey, hold on, we need to ask some questions here. And then they were being shamed by those who were they, that if you ask certain questions at this time, you're not American. Well, I found that offensive to the core and said, okay, that's not the right answer. There were 70 right answers, and that was not one of them. So let's dig deeper. Let's go further. And I found this thread happening across the country. After all Scarlet is a thread. Before she was a color, she was a thread. So she becomes this woman who I become some of the time. That's where I put my feelings. And I guess maybe, Tom, maybe there's this deep down hope that this place that I love, this spirit, her soul, that the Native Americans have been caretaking, and some of us that are of European descent also, must come out of sleep, must look at what's going on. And when I got to Europe, on the second leg of the tour, I started to get more information. And I realized, oh dear.
Playing live is really important to you, isn't it? In terms, some artists like to just make their art in the studio and send it out into the world, but you seem to be telling me that the actual experience of interacting with those people night after night is profoundly part of what you do and why you do it.
Well, there's a part of me that's this little old lady that sits beside these fires with the camps, with the soldiers. And, you know, they give me nice little dinner, and they take care of me. And I have my little cane, and I hobble to and fro, and kind of listen. Hear what they say, file it somewhere, you know, write it on the body. As Jeanette Winterson said years ago, and I just love that phrase, written on the body, and that's become so much a part of what Scarlett's discovering, is that pictures and imprints are written on you, emblazoned on you. You can't see it. If you put us under a microscope, you wouldn't see it, but it's burning our skin. And so, yeah, I think I'm this little lady, sometimes just trying to take people's stories, because people's stories are much more exciting to me than anything fantasy that what people are feeling and going through. that's just wow. I'm never bored.
You also have to evolve year on year. That you've worked consistently. You've developed the approach. When you've dealt with one area, you've kind of moved on and found another area and worked it.
Are you saying I'm like a little old lady? You are. That's okay.
Well, it's interesting, but at the same time, it's a little bit disingenuous because I mean, you are a storyteller and a little old lady in the community, but you're also like a phenomenally professional musician in terms of the development of your chops, the standard of the playing that you deliver in a live show and on record. You're also like a considerable musician. I mean, that's another entire strand that you must be taking care of parallel with all this.
Well, you just have to go to the woodshed and do the work. I think that's one of those things where, there are no shortcuts to that. That's not an abstract thing. You just have to go do the work. And I think playing with Matt and John, I'll be touring with them when I tour because the rhythm was so important. I felt like, I talked about it with them. And I talked about it with husband because, husband is... He and Marcel Van Limbeek, so Mark Hawley, my husband, and Marcel Van Limbeek have been my partners as engineers in sound, I guess you could say, sound dudes. And so we'll talk about, okay, live, how's this going to translate? And last time, it really felt like Alone at the Piano was the right way to go after doing a cover record. Strip it back. I'd been out with a full band, more of the rock thing. And so I kind of thought, I don't know what I'm going to do after this record, but this record demanded that the rhythms and the melodies be there. So it's percussion, drums, Matt's bringing all his little gadgets and gizmos, and John on bass, and Rhodes swirling, of course, the Buzendorfer.
But it's interesting, he plays the kit almost like a loop, like a sample. He's so precise on his timing. I mean,
Yes.
Was he working to click tracks and stuff in the studio, or is that just his own natural time?
Well, the crazy thing about what he's got going on in his headphones, it doesn't make sense to any of us what he's got going on in his headphones, because I don't hear what he hears. I cannot play to that. No. Because as I've said, we have to pause, we have to, give a breath here, and we need to retard, and he'll say, okay, don't worry, you do that and we'll figure it out. So sometimes he'll have Mark cutting that click off and then bringing it back in a bar once I'm in again. But he and I are doing live performance. I tracked everything with Matty, almost everything with Matty. I mean, there might be a moment when I was tracking to some little shaker thing going on, and then he did something on top. But for the most part, I felt like it was about getting a relationship going, where he would put the hi-hat, when the pedal would go down, where there's a breath. And he's like my brother, but when we were playing, he would personify the male character a lot.
It's interesting, though, because a lot of singer-songwriters, sometimes that's even used as a term of abuse in the folk world. He's a bit of a singer-songwriter.
I know.
But a lot of the time it's just somebody hacking away at an acoustic guitar and the band playing straight 4/4 behind them. And this is so different.
Well, lots of singer-songwriters are wonderful poets. They really are. And some of them aren't really players. And, everybody's such an individual. And I guess because being a player was maybe my first port of call. And that was the plan, the master plan, to be a pianist. And I let them all down. And I guess it's one of those things where, let's face it, Lennon and McCartney were a huge inspiration to so many of us. And in 1968, I kind of went, I know this Mozart guy's really good, but I can't do this. And I can't do it as well as my contemporaries. I mean, I realized that it wasn't in me like it was in them. And you've got to know when you cannot hold up, You've got to know it. So I said, this Lennon thing, there's something in this. I really think there's something in this.
And the other surprising influence, really, was Led Zeppelin.
Oh, yeah.
Why?
Oh, come on. First of all, let's talk about the rhythm section. Let's talk about that. Because core, for Robert and Jimmy to do what they do and did, and so great at what they did, but the canvas, the skin.
You hear Page and Plant now, and it's not the same.
Well, great rhythm sections are very hard to find, and the genius of those two together. Come on, it's just one of those magical things that happens, and is so rare. But I guess also the melodies, and Robert's, I've always said, because he's one of my favorite people, he and Peter Gabriel, two of my favorite people of all time. Peter, who gave me the advice, have your own studio. Do it. You must do it, because if you ever fall out with a record company, guess who they've got to call to get the master tapes? So, I treasure that advice, never knowing that I might have to use it one day. It did come in handy a little while ago. And that Robert, well, to me, he just embodies the goddess. He's just one of those people. Gotta love that side of him.
Okay, I didn't get any sleeve notes with the album. I've heard the whole album through, but it doesn't say who's playing on the album or where you recorded it. Could you tell me a little about that?
Recorded at Martian in Cornwall. Martian Engineering, that's our little studio. In our old barn, which works out really well. And the musicians, Matt Chamberlain on drums, one of my favorite drummers in the whole world. John Evans on bass, out of San Francisco. He's more of a jazz player, but I just love his playing. Robbie McIntosh coming and playing some guitar, along with a guy called Mac Aladdin that Matt Chamberlain turned me on to, and David Torn on guitars. John Philip Chanel arranging the strings, and Sinfonia of London playing.
I heard those real strings in there and wondered how you managed to get them all in.
Bigger studio. We recorded at Whitfield Street for the strings.
Okay. Well, now, the drums in particular struck me on this album. The drums are right at the heart of the whole thing. The way they're recorded, they sound fresh and crisp as they went down. They're not kind of buried in the back. They're right there in the pulse of the whole thing.
Right.
Has the drummer read all the lyrics and everything before even beginning to pick up a pair of drumsticks?
Well, I think he and I are very close. He's like a brother to me, and I've played with him for years. And when he knew that this record was a story, and when he knew that Scarlett, my character, is being pulled into the Native American world, the mythology, the past, the present, the future. His grandfather is Navajo and was on the res for a while. So Matt has that orientation also, my grandfather being Eastern Cherokee. So I guess the idea of the drums, sometimes they're delicate, sometimes they're just as a pulse, but it's very much the body moving, you moving to the music, and the melody never being overshadowed, but they work together.
It's integral, isn't it,
yes.
really?